and welcome to a review video for exam 5. In this video I'm going to be talking about determinism and incompatibilism, incompatibilist theories. There might be a lot in this one, but just starting with the first section, just going chronologically as we did in class, starting with just what is determinism. So, determinism is, the basic idea is that everything that happens is the inevitable result of the distant past. Everything is determined. So the future state of the world at any given time, and together with the laws of nature, guarantee a single future state of the world. So state of the world, we just mean a complete list of every object that exists at the certain time and the properties of those objects at the time. So you can think of the state of the world as just like a snapshot that takes a photo kind of a particular second or minute, and then even though we can't see all the details, all the objects in that snapshot, suppose all the objects that exist and their properties are there, and you can probably zoom in, kind of metaphorically, I guess, on all of these objects to see their properties. So, state of the world, the time right now, is me, the fact that I have brown hair, my laptop, and so on. So that's just what we mean by state of the world at a given time. And by laws of nature, you can just think of like laws of physics, chemistry, biology, things like that. So one way to think of determinism is like a function. So the distant past, this is like 65 million BCE, this input, when you put it through the function plus the laws of nature, guarantees the output, you making the decision to go to UCF and eventually ending up at UCF. So even though before I made that decision to go to UCF, it was already predetermined by the past and the laws of nature. This is the only way things could have gone. I wasn't aware, so, before I made that decision, I wasn't aware that I was going to go to UCF. When I was 5 years old, I had no idea what UCF was. I was not aware of the fact that I was going to make that decision. Nonetheless, it was always true that I was going to make that decision, given the distant past and the laws of nature. So you plug in this input, and the output every time is going to be you making the decision to go to UCF. Another important thing about determinism, this is the importance of the function part maybe, is that it's different from fatalism. So fatalism is the thesis that determinism is true and there is only one possible first state of the world. That's not what determinism alone says. So according to determinism, same input, same output, but you can get a different output. How can you get a different output? A different input. So suppose the past went a different way. This pterodactyl is here rather than a dinosaur just eating a tree, whatever. Changes. Different input, different output. You end up making the decision to go to USF instead. Go Bulls, am I right? So things could have been another way, but given the way things were and the laws of nature, that guarantees the single future. And if things were this way, that would also guarantee just one single future as well. So that's just to lay out determinism. So now that we've laid out what determinism is, we haven't provided an argument for determinism necessarily. This is just kind of like what determinism would mean. With that laid out, we can consider what determinism entails or does not entail. So you'll notice the primary question here is the compatibility question. If determinism is true, can there still be free will? is determinism's truth compatible with the existence of free will? So notice how just the thesis of determinism, this doesn't say anything about human free will. So you'd have to give an argument as to why the two are incompatible, even though a lot of us kind of would have thought from the beginning that determinism is incompatible with free will. That's not what it says, face value, so you'd have to give an argument for that position. Nonetheless, a lot of philosophers are actually compatibilists, and compatibilism is the thesis that determinism and free will are compatible. These are the theories that I went over in the previous review video, so there's another video posted on that goes into these specifically. These are how we started the unit. So we talked about desire theory, higher order desire theory, that's Frankfurt, and the sane deep self view from Wolff. Those are all compatibilist theories. In other words, those theories of free will are compatible with determinism being true. It can be true that we are free in the sense that these theorists think, and well-determinism also being true. So you might wonder, how is desire theory, for example, compatible with determinism? So you could run this kind of thought experiment for all of these. You can think of all of these as building on each other, though. So higher order desire theory builds off of desire theory, and the sane deep self view builds off of deep self views, one of them being desire theory. So just to lay it out, just so it's more clear, you can just use the simplest one. But again, you can do this with all of them. So you can just kind of put desire theory is, and again, there's another video on this, but freedom is the power or ability to do what you want to do. I want to pick up this piece of paper, so I do. And I have the power to, so I'm free. That action is free. So we can map out a determinist account of the world. Say it starts with, this is a first state of the world, the Big Bang happens. That wouldn't be the first day of the universe, but you go back as far as you want. End up the first day of the world, there's, all these cosmic things going on, big bangs, life is forming. That eventually causes dinosaur life. Dinosaur life eventually leads to, or not dinosaur life specifically, but these events, the events that happen here eventually lead to your distant ancestors, and then say eventually your mom and your dad, who eventually, through many of their own actions, they have their own desires, they have their own actions, so on, eventually lead to you, and then eventually you make the decision, I want to go to UCF, and then you take the action upon your decision to go to UCF, and then you end up at UCF. So desire theory can really just take this small last bit of this timeline here, and that's really what we're concerned with when we're talking about it, because that's relevant. You have the desire, I want to go to UCF, and you have the power to act on it. So you did, and now you're here. You did it freely. And you caused that decision from your desire. So that's just one part of it. You can work backwards, and your parents did all these things that eventually caused you, and all these things happened that before that caused your parents, and it goes back and back. This is just basically a very long chain of causation. However, your actions, your desires, the desires that would eventually cause your actions, those were predetermined. Those were determined by everything that happened before you, the state of the world that happened before you. But that's fine. Your desires still caused your actions. It doesn't matter that your actions were predetermined by things that happened millions and millions of years ago. Your desires and your actions are just small parts in a long causal chain. So your parents also had the power to act on their desires. All of that eventually led, again, to you. So you didn't know. I mean, when you were 5 years old, you didn't know that you would eventually make the decision to go to UCF. It was always going to be true that you would make the decision to go to UCF. Just, it could be forecasted given the past and given the desires that you would end up having. But nonetheless, your desires still cause your will, your actions, and you have the power to do that freely. So you're free. So that's just to explain a little bit how the compatibilist theories we talk about are compatibilist. But now we're kind of shifting to what we talk about in the other few days that we talked about it in class, and that is incompatibilist theories. So incompatibilism is the theory that if determinism is true, then we have no free will. So there are different versions of compatibilism. Just to give you a preview of what we're going to see when we go into incompatibilism. So first, libertarian incompatibilism, of course, agrees that incompatibilism is true and says that we do have free will. It takes a stance on the fact that we do have free will. Hard incompatibilism, on the other hand, again, agrees incompatibilism is true, and we have no free will. So hard incompatibilism isn't sure whether or not determinism actually is true, but either way, we don't have free will. Libertarian incompatibilism, since it claims that incompatibilism is true and we have free will, the result of this is that determinism is false, or determinism isn't true. You don't need to specifically know that. It's just, or maybe you will, not specifically in those terms at least. You don't need to think too hard about these or the arguments for them right now. We just want to preview incompatibilism at least first. So Van Inwagen provides the argument for incompatibilism, that is the consequence argument. Again, it's not really relevant to the argument whether or not we actually do have free will, but he presents the consequence argument for incompatibilism. That's his argument for incompatibilism. We also talk about Paraboom afterwards. He's a hard incompatibilist, and yeah, we'll get there when we get there. But starting with Van Inwagen, so before we even talk about what kind of compatibilist we are, whether we're libertarian or hard incompatibilist, we first need to figure out if compatibilism is even true. So Van Inwagen offers an argument for incompatibilism being true, and it begins with, this is a consequence argument, it begins with assume determinism is true. So this is not an argument for determinism's truth, but we just, for the sake of argumentative purposes, assume determinism is true. The second premise, dino is an untouchable fact. That's terminology that out of context makes no sense, but this is in your guys' notes, and maybe you guys remember, dino is the state of the world at an arbitrary moment at 65 million BCE plus the laws of nature. What does it mean for dino to be an untouchable fact? An untouchable fact is a fact that no human being in history has ever had the power to change. So it's pretty obvious that dino, the state of the world, 65 million BCE, is not a fact that any human being has ever had the power to change. Most obviously, no humans existed then, so certainly no human being, they weren't even there, they certainly couldn't have done anything about it. So, yeah, no human being, this is essentially saying no human being has ever had the power to change dino, or the state of the world, at 65 million BCE. That's pretty obvious. You don't even need to, speculate, really, determinism to agree with that. Again, it's pretty clear. This third premise, it is an untouchable fact that if dino, then I'm in philosophy class on 7/29/2025. So that is to say, no human being has ever had the power to change the fact that if the state of the world 65 million BCE, then I would be in philosophy class at 7/29/2025. So this is, again, assuming determinism's truth. So defense of this premise, no one has ever had the power to change the fact that the past plus the laws of nature guarantee the present. Again, assuming determinism is true. Just like the fact that no human being has ever had the power to change the fact that combining this chemical with that chemical creates that chemical. I don't know enough about chemistry to think of a specific example off the top of my head, but no human being has ever had the power to change that fact. It is also true that if determinism is true, it was guaranteed. The present state of the world was guaranteed by the distant past. If it was guaranteed, obviously no human has ever had the power to change it. Another way to think about this premise, and you don't need to think of it this way, but you could think this is kind of saying, before we even get here, maybe an abstracted version of this is, if determinism is true, then, again, this is all resting on the assumption, if determinism is true, you can zoom out and think, if determinism is true, then no human has ever had the power to change the fact that determinism is true. If determinism were true, we couldn't do anything about it, certainly. And that's, again, another way to think of it before you zoom in and say, well, I mean, this, if dino, then class, that's a result of determinism. So, again, yeah, if determinism is an untouchable fact, which is pretty obvious, if determinism were true, we certainly couldn't do anything about it. Then this result of determinism, if dino, then class, is an untouchable fact. No one would have the power to change it. It was guaranteed by the past and the laws of nature. So that's defense of the third premise. Fourth premise, therefore, it is an untouchable fact that I'm in philosophy class on 7/29/2025. So defense, here we go back to the untouchability principle. The untouchability principle is, if P is an untouchable fact, and if P then Q is an untouchable fact, then therefore Q is an untouchable fact. So that's kind of in a logic-y abstraction. If you want, you can, just to make it sound less wordy in your mind, first just shorten untouchable fact to be fact. Know you're thinking of untouchable fact when you say fact, but you can really just think of it as, if P is a fact, and if P then Q is also a fact, it's a fact that logical relation, if P then Q, holds, then Q is also a fact. This is, in form, very similar to, if you know that P, and you know that if P then Q, then you also know Q. So that's it. We mentioned it's another kind of closure principle, and that's kind of what it's doing here too. And you can also think of it as transitivity. So if you know, something being an untouchable fact is a transitivity relation. It is translated in this very simple logical form, which is just P, if P then Q, therefore Q. So that's how the untouchability principle, that's how we end up with, therefore it is an untouchable fact that you're in philosophy class on 7/29/25. And look at this, I suppose, a bit more. What does it mean for it being that it's an untouchable fact that you're in philosophy class on 7/29/2025? It means that you nor any human ever had the power to change the fact that you are in philosophy class on 7/29/2025, even though it seemed this morning when you thought about, or that morning, when you thought about whether or not you were going to go to class, it really seemed like you had the power to change, or that you would have had the power to change whether you did or not in that moment. However, this means that no human being, including you, has ever had the power to change the fact that you would be in philosophy class on this particular date. And then to make sure this is a valid conclusion of this argument, we add the conditional if determinism is true. So the conclusion is, therefore, if determinism is true, then it's an untouchable fact that I'm in philosophy class on 7/29/2025. So again, we assume determinism is true here, and we have to bring that back in to the conclusion. However, this isn't exactly the same language as incompatibilism. Remember, this is an argument for incompatibilism. And this conclusion here doesn't exactly say incompatibilism. However, when you think about what this conclusion means, it turns out to be the same thing as incompatibilism. So, in effect, this conclusion tells us that if determinism is true, you couldn't have done otherwise than be in philosophy class on 7/29/2025. And remember, this is the first thing we actually talked about on the first sheet of notes that we had here. The ability to do otherwise condition. A person X's action/choice A is free only if X was able to not do A. So freedom requires the ability to do otherwise. In order for me to freely pick up this paper, I had to be able to not pick up that paper. And so what it tells us is that if determinism is true, you've never had the power to change the fact that you would be in philosophy class. And that's basically the same thing as saying you couldn't have done otherwise than be in philosophy class. So that's how we end up with, that's how we end up equating the conclusion here, C5, with incompatibilism. If determinism is true, you couldn't have done otherwise than be in a philosophy class, even though it really felt like you could have done otherwise that morning. So hopefully you understand this is Van Inwagen's argument for incompatibilism. And like we mentioned, there are still varieties of incompatibilism. We'll come back to hard incompatibilism with Paraboom, but moving on. So the consequences argument assumes determinism is true, and the result is a conditional if determinism is true. The result is a claim that if determinism is true, then we have no free will, which is incompatibilism. However, you might wonder, you might think, well, what if determinism isn't true? Does that mean we have free will? I mean, we ran through the process of imagining what it would be like if determinism is true. Then, okay, maybe you're convinced by his argument that entails we don't have free will. But what if determinism isn't true? Does that mean we do have free will? Unfortunately, no. At least that's what the following argument will end up proving. So this is a randomness argument, also called the threat from randomness. So you could sort out the threats to free will as one, the threat of determination, which is what the other argument focused on. If determinism is true, or if things are determined, then you don't have free will. And the other threat is randomness. So the argument starts with the premise, if determinism is false, again, we're assuming determinism's falsity, just like we assumed determinism's truth in the other argument. If determinism is false, then whether or not I decide to lie is a matter of random chance. So to illustrate this, or to defend this premise, this thought experiment is called the rollback intuition, and it concerns Alice. So suppose Alice is trying to decide in the moment whether to tell the truth or to lie. So the first time this plays out, she decides to tell the truth. That's her decision. It was undetermined until she made it right then. It was indeterminate, and by deciding it, that was what she did. That's what happened. She did it freely and indeterminate. Or supposedly freely, I guess. And then the idea here is, if it wasn't determined by anything, it was indeterminate, just like how a coin flip is indeterminate, if it's a fair coin at least, then if we replay the decision process, so suppose there's a godlike being that can just click rewind or do the rollback. That's what rollback, I guess, would mean. I think replay is a maybe easier way of thinking about it. To click replay or rewind, play it again, then, and back to the moment just before she made the decision, play it again, and then what would happen the second time? Maybe she would tell the truth again, or maybe she would lie this time. Again, it was indeterminate, just like how when you flip a coin. Just like how if you flip a coin, when you rewind, and suppose it's an even coin flip, if you rewind to that very same second, again, if it's a fair coin flip, it will land on heads sometimes and tails other times, and you won't know. You won't know, and there won't be any fact of the matter before this coin flip happens. So suppose a godlike being rewinds it, and then what will happen, if it's not determined, is sometimes she'll lie, other times she'll tell the truth. And if we can imagine this just like with how any sort of like a coin flip would work, if you do it enough times, it will probably turn out to be around 50-50, just like how 50% of the time you'll get heads on a coin, 50% of the time you'll get tails. 50% of the time about Alice will lie, the other 50% she'll tell the truth. So it's basically, and even, importantly, I guess, even if it ended up that 75% of the time, or 70% of the time she tells the truth, and 30% of the time she lies, it was still random. Even if, one ended up happening more times than the other, it was still random, supposing it was indeterminate. So, I think the easiest way to think about this is just to kind of, if you think about when you click the rewind button and just doing that over and over, as long as things are indeterminate, there will supposedly, again, be no fact of the matter as to whether she will lie or tell the truth the next time around, or the next time around, or so on. So that's the rollback intuition, the defense of the first premise. The second premise, I have no control over what occurs as a matter of random chance. This is pretty intuitive as a premise, but we provide a thought experiment as a defense anyway. So this is a random decision generator. So suppose Brock has a generator installed on his head that randomizes his decision to steal or not to steal, like a coin flip. Again, essentially, to use that comparison, I think it makes it the easiest to visualize, for me at least. It randomizes whether he's going to steal or not to steal. Suppose he does steal. The question is he responsible for stealing? And most people will say, no, it was a matter of random chance. He's not responsible, probably because he had no control over it. It was completely randomized. And then the conclusion is, therefore, if determinism is false, then I have no control over whether or not I decide to lie. And importantly, you can substitute any decision or action into here and get the same thing. Decide to drink water, decide to go to class, decide to go to UCF, so on and so on. And then you end up with, if determinism is false, then I have no control over the things I do, which is kind of a lot like saying, if determinism is false, then I'm not free. If you have no control over it, then it kind of seems like you're not free. So that's the randomness argument as a threat to free will. And then this is what leaves us with the paradox of free will. So, face value, it seems a paradox is a set of propositions that are individually plausible but jointly logically inconsistent. So first premise or proposition here, we have free will. That seems pretty plausible to me. There's the experience of free will. There's a way that we usually act, like throughout our daily lives. And then there's also the moral responsibility that we attach to free will. So we assign blame or praise to ourselves and others for good and bad things we did, and that assumes that we did them freely. Our criminal justice system also presupposes that people act freely most of the time, and we have laws in place to kind of make, maybe you can think of them as exceptions, when someone isn't free, like they were coerced into committing a crime. And we regularly want to say there's a difference between someone who was forced by a mad scientist machine or coerced versus someone who wasn't. That this person was free, the other person wasn't in their action. And then we have the proposition, if determinism is true, then we have no free will. That's the incompatibilist thesis. That was what the Van Inwagen argument, the consequence argument, got us. And then we also have the result of the randomness argument. If determinism is false, then we have no free will. So we have two, basically, if determinism is true or if determinism is false, either way, we don't have free will. Still, we think we have free will. So this is a big paradox. And yeah, so now moving on to hard incompatibilists, which interestingly, they choose to reject this first proposition. So you can kind of think of it, if it's a paradox, then in order to make sense of this paradox, you have to reject at least one proposition. So hard incompatibilists reject the first proposition, the proposition that we have free will. Getting into hard incompatibilism, this is Derek Pereboom's stance. So as a reminder, hard incompatibilism is a thesis that incompatibilism is true and we have no free will. So before getting into what Derek Pereboom thinks, Pereboom reconstructs the argument of his opponent, basically. So this is an argument against hard incompatibilism, and it's the bad consequences argument. So someone might say, belief in hard incompatibilism has bad consequences. So if we accept hard incompatibilism, then we reject moral responsibility. And rejecting moral responsibility may lead to the belief that nothing is morally right or wrong. So first, if someone's not morally responsible for something, if someone's not morally responsible for cheating, then is it even wrong to cheat? They're not responsible. The second part is the belief that criminal punishment becomes unjustifiable, or is unjustifiable. So if someone isn't responsible for committing the crime that they did, then how can we justify putting them in prison and charging them as a criminal? They weren't responsible for doing it. So that's a defense of the first premise, belief in hard incompatibilism has bad consequences. The second premise, we should not hold beliefs that have bad consequences. Again, whether or not you're sold on this premise, Pereboom's just kind of reconstructing what he believes his opponent's argument to be. So this is part of it, and then the conclusion is, therefore, we should not believe in hard incompatibilism. this argument doesn't pretend to be a thesis that disproves hard incompatibilism. It's just kind of saying whether or not hard incompatibilism is true, we should not believe in hard incompatibilism. So that's all this argument is really saying, but Pereboom comes back and he's, you can kind of think of him as, classic philosophy paper fashion going, some opponents might say this, to which I respond. Then he gives his response, which is based on punishment without moral responsibility. So there are different theories of punishment used across different cultures, believed by different people, maybe within the same culture. A theory of punishment gives a general justification for punishing wrongdoers. So why do we punish wrongdoers or criminals? The retributivist theory says something along the lines of criminal punishment is justified because criminals deserve to be punished for their crimes. So it's about this, cosmic balance, I suppose, that, because they did this wrong thing, they deserve to feel the punishment of it. That's what some people might say as a theory of punishment. However, Pereboom just believes this isn't a good theory of punishment, and we can actually maintain a lot of the same parts of our legal system with an alternative theory of punishment, which I believe he thinks is a bit more reasonable, and that is the contagion theory. So contagion theory says criminal punishment is justified because, like quarantine, it prevents criminals from further harming society. So prison and other criminal punishments are more like just to protect other people in society. It's to prevent things like that, to prevent them from hurting other people. So punishment can be justified even when the wrongdoer isn't morally responsible. And you could even put wrongdoer in quotes. They might not be morally responsible, but punishment can still be justified. And to see this, we have the case of the contagious child. So suppose a child is born with a very highly contagious sickness that kills other children, other people at rapid rates. This is a very sad situation. The child did nothing to deserve this. A lot of people feel very bad for this child. However, most people would say it's permissible to put the child in quarantine to keep them from harming other people in society, from the result of them killing other children, which is what would happen if you didn't quarantine them. So yes, it's very sad, but it is justifiable. And again, no one's going to say that this child is responsible for this, but still, it's permissible to quarantine them for something they are not responsible for. So, Pereboom believes that there's not really a significant difference between the sick child and the criminal in jail, at least in this regard. So, the criminal, Jeffrey Dahmer, we used this example in class, can be, even if they weren't responsible for their actions, it was all predetermined, they couldn't have done anything about it, or it was just random, and that also entails they couldn't have done anything about it. It is still permissible to lock Jeffrey Dahmer up to keep him from harming other people in society. So basically, the contagious child is analogous to imprisoning criminals. They're not responsible, but still justifiably imprisoned for the good of society. And you might think that, is it kind of weird that we're comparing a poor child and a Jeffrey Dahmer? a murderer and cannibal, but you might feel more sympathetic to the child than you do to Jeffrey Dahmer, but, you know, that shouldn't really matter as to just because you feel very bad for this child, that doesn't that doesn't mean that you shouldn't quarantine them. I mean, you still have to. So, if you can do it even with feeling bad for this child, and you can justify it even with how bad you feel for this child, then certainly you can justify it for criminals too. It shouldn't even matter that you feel maybe less bad for them, but even if you do, that's the result here. So, the important details in both cases is that someone is irresponsible, not morally responsible for the action that's getting them locked up, but nonetheless, it is justifiable to lock them up or quarantine them either way. So there's a lot gone over in this particular video, but it was mainly incompatibilism and different theories with incompatibilism. And yes, I hope this helps. Thank you for watching.